All right. Before we jump into Letitia's story, I just want to give a disclaimer. We're going to be talking about child abuse, sexual abuse, and domestic violence. So if any of these things trigger you, definitely please step away, take care of yourself, ground down, do what you need to do. And then I invite you to come back and listen because Letitia has she has an incredible story and some amazing resources to help you heal. So I invite you to come back when you're ready, when you're able, but definitely please take care of yourself and know that this may bring some things up for you and take care of yourself. That's most important. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Healing Doesn't Have to Be Heavy podcast. I'm your host, Angie Berrett with Angie Berrett Movement. And I help people use play and movement to connect to their bodies, releasing limiting self beliefs, stress, anxiety, tension, depression, and trauma with play and movement so they can have more joy and peace in their lives. And part of my mission is to bring so many different resources to people, to provide opportunities, to give options for healing so that healing doesn't have to be heavy. And I have an amazing guest for you today. I'm so excited for y'all to meet her. She has the most amazing energy and vibe. So without further ado, let me introduce her. I have Leticia, Francis with me. And she's not here to just inspire you. She's here to activate you. As a survivor, a keynote speaker, and a trauma recovery mentor, Letitia knows what it's like to fight battles no one sees. Letitia also knows that breaking free is possible. Letitia's work is about disrupting survival mode, exposing trauma-driven cycles, and giving women the blueprint to reclaim their lives. So Letitia, welcome.
Hi, Angie. I'm so excited to be here. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? I'm so excited to have you. I just have to say, I love your energy. I love your hair. And I think that that is so fun. I love it.
Thank you. I'm really excited. And yes, we have had time
Yes.
previous where we have literally bounced off the walls as a result of our energy exchange. So I'm super happy to be here today.
I'm so excited to have you. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey, how you got into this work, and tell us about you. Tell us all about you.
Yeah, so I am a girl that grew up in little island of Bermuda in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. My journey, my awakening, I would say, came in England. But before we get to England, I at the age of 7, I was told that my birth was the reason for my parents' divorce. My father gave me his narrative of why the marriage broke down, and in his version, it was my birth.
Mhm.
At 7, I didn't know how to process that. And as a result, I really struggled with my identity and my purpose in life, which sounds crazy, but at 7, learning that me existing broke the most important relationship in my life, I struggled with my self-worth.
Mhm.
And both of my parents remarried. Both of their partners wanted nothing to do with me. So
Wow.
I grew up in the middle of a family unit trying to figure out who I was. And that left me craving attention. And ultimately, I sought that attention from a man.
Mhm.
I was molested shortly after that news. And while I knew what was happening was wrong, this man was showing me something that my parents was not.
Yeah.
And so it became like this craving for me to have attention. Um, I lost my virginity to rape at 12. And
Wow.
by the time I was 14, I was in a relationship with someone who was in his 30s.
Oh,
Um,
Lord.
that relationship was highly abusive. Um, but it was the lesser of the two evils.
Mhm.
While I was being abused, I still had what I thought was love and attention from someone.
Mhm.
Because the opposite of that, or the alternative to that, was the two family units that
Mhm.
really had no time for me. The first time he put his hands on me, I was 15. He choked
Wow.
me out, attempted to choke me out, and I left the relationship because I knew that a man should not put his hands on a woman. However, the contention at my in my home increased, and I was actually mocked by my mom's husband. One day we got in an argument, and I said to him, I feel like killing myself.
Oh,
And he
wow.
said, well, do it.
Oh
He
my
called
word.
everybody into the kitchen and they watched me attempt suicide and no one stopped me.
Oh my.
So I ended up under psychiatric care,
Mhm.
having to navigate this attempt on my life. Um, and it drove me back to this man who was showing me love and attention.
Or what
I,
you were able to perceive at that very young age was love and
yes,
attention. Yes.
yes. I ended up marrying him when I was 19, and and the whole time from after my suicide up until we got married, I was being abused. And I a huge part of me had the reconciliation that this was wrong.
Mhm.
But if you understand abuse, it's a reason why people stay. There is a perpetual cycle that unfolds, that kind of keeps you sucked in to the chaos that becomes your relationship. At 21, my husband stabbed me,
Oh my gosh.
and I knew then that it was time to leave. What was interesting is right before the stabbing occurred, a friend of mine called me for some relationship advice. She was unaware of the abuse that I had endured for years. And I picked up a book by Ian Van Zant called Until Today.
Okay.
And it's a daily devotional. And I randomly opened the page and read her a passage to encourage her. The passage that I read was talking about the that interpersonal relationships do not work oftentimes because people are meant to be in our lives for a reason, a season, and a lifetime. And oftentimes we're holding on to the people who are only meant to be there for a reason and a season. And that was actually an aha moment for me. Like, the reason why this relationship isn't working is because he's not meant to be in my life anymore.
Yeah.
That was the night he tried to kill me. And I managed to get out of that situation. I often talk about it being an outer body experience.
Mhm.
Um, and I was left having to pick the pieces, left to pick up the pieces of my life. I was very naive in thinking when I left this relationship, everything would fall into place. Life would go back to normal, if I even knew what normal was. But the problem that I had was I am no longer in a relationship that I had been for
Mhm.
8 years. My entire identity was tied to that relationship. And previous to that, my identity was tied to my interpersonal relationships with my parents.
Yeah.
I was now 22 years old and I didn't know who I was. And I was in a lot of pain and no tools and no support to help me. And that landed me at the bottom of at the bottom of bottle of scotch
Mm.
every single day to numb and to silence what was going on in my mind.
Yeah.
That process of leaving my first husband began a decade-long journey of me in toxic relationships, repeating toxic cycles. And while I was not being physically abused, because at that time, that's the only abuse that I was aware of. I was still being emotionally abused. I was being financially abused. I was suffering through coercive control by these men who took full advantage of my inability to love myself.
Isn't it
I
interesting how when we are trauma survivors, we're willing to accept until we go through that healing journey, we're willing to accept something that's less that bad than it was before because we don't know anything better. It's better than what it was. And
Mhm.
until we break and heal from that cycle, we're willing to accept some of that maltreatment and that horrible abuse because we don't know anything better.
Absolutely. And each relationship got slightly better.
Mhm.
However, I was still stuck. I was progressing in my career. I was working in commercial insurance. I was top in my department. I knew my work immensely. However, everything else outside of the office was a complete mess.
Yeah.
I was eventually arrested on my corporate job as a result of a relationship that I was in. My boyfriend was stealing, and I had received the stolen goods unbeknownst to me, and I was swiftly taken off my corporate job
Wow.
and taken to the police station. And in that, I called my mother and I called my mom and I was like, listen, I need you to get me a lawyer. You know what so
Yeah.
and so did, and now it's coming and falling on me. So instead of her calling a lawyer, she brought herself down to the police station. And in that visiting time, she said something to me that essentially changed everything for me. She asked me why I love everybody else more than I love myself. And that was a Mike Tyson body blow. Like she took my hand. I could
Yeah.
not breathe. But it was like the biggest reality check ever. I had to leave that visitation room and go back to a cell and sit with that.
Yeah.
I sat with the fact that I had made some very poor decisions. Now, I wasn't the reason why I was in jail that day. However, there was a reconciliation that my decisions were the reason for me being in jail that day. And I decided that day that I had to fix the problem. I was never charged. I was later released after about 8 hours.
Oh, good.
And the first thing I did was call a life coach that I had come in contact with in my journey. And I started working with this coach. She was raw. She was unapologetic. She did not let me get away with anything. And one of the things that I learned quite quickly was I had very tightly held on to the fact that I was a victim.
Oh,
It was an identity that I earned 10 toes down.
yeah.
And what she made me see was in my ownership of being a victim, I was giving all of my power away.
Hmm.
That was life-changing because I would always say that I am this independent woman who has survived everything that
Yes.
has been thrown at her. And independence does not align with giving away my power.
Yeah.
So what I had to learn in that process was four things. I had to learn how to like myself. I had to learn who I was. I had to learn how to accept myself. And I had to learn to own my flaws. And as a result of that, I decided to leave Bermuda and I moved to England. This was an opportunity for me to start over, to reinvent myself per se. And I did just that. I was still in commercial insurance. I was climbing the corporate ladder. And then I had two children back to back. And there was this reconciliation because in England you get a full year of maternity leave.
Oh, wow.
So in 3 years, I was out of work for two. And those 2 years helped me realize that while I was growing in my career, I hated it. I
Mm.
hated insurance. I was actually in a very toxic environment. I was working out of Lloyd's of London, and for those who do not know, Lloyd's of London is the birthplace of insurance. Anyone who works in commercial insurance would love to work in this institution. But the problem was, I was a foreign black woman
Mm.
in a white male dominated industry. And not only was I a foreign black woman, someone had the nerve to hire me as a manager,
Oh, so even worse than just being in the industry, you now were in
running
charge of things.
departments. I had a multinational team of over 20. I was running the biggest department in my group, and the people that I worked with had a problem with it. I remember being in a meeting and being called a little girl.
Oh,
And my manager then telling me after I put that man promptly in his place that I was the reason for the tensions on the call that day. And there was this reconciliation. I literally spent decades being abused.
yeah, yeah.
Now I'm being paid to be abused. And I was not about that life. So I decided to take the things that I learned about my strengths, the fullness of my personality, the too muchness that seemed to be a threat to the white man that I worked with. And I created a coaching business, which allowed me to then help women instead of making a company millions.
Yes.
I wanted to help women change their lives. And I did that I've now been in business nearly 6 years. But the biggest aha moment for me during this journey was when I decided to write a memoir. And my memoir helped me really reconcile all of the patterns and the repeated cycles that I had seen myself in. And there was this awakening that I actually had been in survival mode for more than 2 decades. And there was this aha, like I can't just continue surviving. I want to start thriving. And I have been actively working towards doing so.
I'm going to
I
ask you
see
a
you have a
question.
question.
I
Yes.
do have a question. I'm going to interrupt you for a minute. How do you define survival mode? For people who may not know what that is, how do you define survival mode and how do people know if they're in survival mode or not?
So for me, I define survival mode as autopilot. I was in autopilot operating on fight and flight 90% of the time. I never had a down moment. I was always ready for a fight. I was hyper vigilant. Everything seemed like a threat to me. And that may seem weird. Like, how could you say you were like that for 20 years? Well, I was like that for 20 years because I was in environments that created that response for me for longer than 20 years. So after and after trauma, you often, let me back this up. In order to overcome trauma, you have to become someone in order to survive. The person that became to survive, I never let go of.
I'm sorry, do you mean during trauma, while you're experiencing the trauma, you have to become someone who can
Y-
adapt to that and survive? Okay, yeah.
yes,
Great. Yes.
yes.
Hmm.
And I never let that person go. So I no longer identified as being a victim, but I was still actively trying to survive the environments that I was in. And I was in those environments because I hadn't learned to change my narrative. I hadn't learned to change my patterns, right? I might have left the chaos, but my patterns hadn't changed.
Yes.
Okay. So there was this reconciliation that I'm in survival mode still. And there was this urge to end it. And I didn't know what that meant at that time. But with my training as a coach, I
Yeah.
was also trauma certified. I spent some time really just digging into what I knew about healing and actively worked to move myself out of a state where I was constantly in fight and flight or anticipating the need to enter fight and flight. And for me, what that looked like, which was three major phases for me. First of all, was self-awareness. We
Okay.
cannot change what we cannot see. I had to get honest with myself
Mhm.
about my ownership in the reason why I was still experiencing the fight and flight response, why I was still allowing myself to settle for circumstances which I knew were out of alignment. Um, One key thing that I learned in my journey of becoming a coach is how much self-awareness is important, how important it is. And I liken it to a lighthouse.
Okay.
A lighthouse allows you to see in the middle of the sea, in the middle of the night. It allows you to see what's in front of you. It allows you to see what's on the left and right of you and what's behind you. And it then gives you the opportunity, now that you see
Mhm.
what's in front of you and around you, to navigate differently. So that was the first step. There was this awareness, self-awareness, and radical ownership of me. The
I'm going to ask you
second,
a question here before we
yes,
move on
sure.
to step two. How did you do that? For many of us, that's incredibly uncomfortable. That's one of the most challenging things that I found on my journey, and I found as I work with my clients, is that acceptance, that total ability to accept, because it brings so much discomfort in your body, in your mind, in all of that. How did you do that?
I did a lot of journaling.
Okay.
I was very I would ask myself questions that I knew would make me feel uncomfortable. And I think when you had that clinical, almost clinical training, right? Like I knew what I needed to do
Yes.
because of the training that I did. And I challenged myself to step and to treat myself as if I was a client, right?
Okay.
So I would challenge my thoughts, which we'll get to because that's part of my next step. But
Okay.
I would challenge myself to journal and be honest with my journaling, which then get opened up more elements or more facets of my needed healing, things that I may not have necessarily been aware of. Just being able to sit down and just purge
Yes.
all of the things that have been bottled up. And often what we see with any type of experience, we often compartmentalize and we stuff things into pretty little containers and pack them away. My journaling process, which I committed to for months, was unpacking everything that had been stored away for me. And interesting enough, because I had just written my memoir, a lot of this stuff was still at the surface, right? Um, I referenced everything that really gave me a tough time when I was writing. I started digging into that.
What did you do as you were digging into that when that discomfort came up? I know you said that you journaled, but oftentimes, and this is something I hear a lot, is as we're starting to do the work, when that discomfort comes up, and in survival mode, we go into shutdown, right? Like we don't want to go near it. It's too uncomfortable. It's too painful. For me, movement helps me to get into that. So what was it that you found on your journey that made it so that it didn't have to be quite so heavy as you were digging into that stuff? Was there something that you did or some resource that you have, some nugget of hope to offer to people listening who are trying to do that but just cannot break free?
That's a good question. You know what? I did not allow myself to shut off the emotion.
Okay.
Usually, the first thing that we do is shut it off.
Yes.
And I processed it because I think, again, it's because I had that training. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like,
Right.
had I not been a coach, it probably would have been a lot harder for me, right? But because I had that training previously, I knew that in order for me to be able to move beyond the things that were hurting, I had to process.
Yes.
So I gave myself permission to process my emotions. I gave myself grace when it was a little too hard, but I didn't allow myself to run away from that. So I let the tears fall. I let the screams come. I allowed myself to rest when it became too much, right? Which on a normal day, I would, okay, we're not going there today.
Push
We
through
ain't
it, keep
giving it
going.
no
Yeah.
more tears. And you better pick your socks up, boo, and keep moving, right? So those were essentially opposites of how I had been operating in survival mode.
I'm going to just make a little plug here for movement and talking about your journaling. I just recently read an article where when we actually write with journaling, and I don't know if you hand wrote or if you
I
typed,
handwrite. Yeah,
you hand
handwrite.
wrote. Okay. So with movement and the actual act of handwriting, it activates into more areas in our brain rather than just even sitting and typing, which allows us to move, to process, to let those emotions flow easier than if you're sitting and typing or scrolling on a phone or anything like that. So for anybody who's taking Letitia's advice and journaling, handwrite it because it's going to activate into more areas of your brain. That actual movement of your arm is going to make a big difference.
Hmm. Absolutely. So that brings me to the
Yes.
second step,
The second
right?
step. Yes.
Yeah, so the second step was reprogramming. One of the things that I learned during my process of becoming a coach is how important our mindset and our thought process is, right? I didn't have the awareness before becoming a coach that I could choose my emotions. And I remember somebody telling me that, like, you don't have to be upset. That's a choice. What the hell you mean it's a choice? I'm mad.
Like, I'm mad and I'm going to be mad. Yes.
Yeah, that reconciliation really opened my eyes to how much a feeling becomes an emotion and our emotions then drive our thoughts and actions. I challenged everything that I thought about myself or I thought to be true. Because one thing about the subconscious mind It knows no difference, right? I can tell myself 1,000 lies and
Yeah.
my brain will believe it. So instead of telling the lies that I can't do this, I am this, or, I reprogram the way that I process my thoughts. And then I caught myself slipping back into this thought processes that kept me stuck, like, oh, you're too much, like nobody's gonna want to hear this, blah blah blah. I would literally out loud challenge myself. I would be like in the kitchen washing dishes, having a bad thought. No, boo, we're not going there today. We're not doing it.
I
And
love I
it's
love the act of actually physically saying it out loud because that's going to resonate more. I'm big into the science of changing the mind. That's going to actually change much more when you can verbally say it out loud than if you just think it or just kind of stuff it down. I love that.
yeah, I would be walking and no, boo, we're not going there today. And anybody that was around me probably thought I was full crazy, but it was what I needed to reprogram my mind.
Yeah.
I'm not aware if the listeners know that 95% of our thoughts are recycled. And more than 50% of our thoughts are absolute lies, right? So if you spend time reprogramming your mind and your thought processes and really challenging your mindset, you essentially can change your life, right?
So along with that, the subconscious and that 95% that you're talking about that controls our mindset is formed by age 7 or 8. And so for those of us who experience childhood trauma, it's formed, that subconscious, those lies are formed based on that trauma that we experienced and being told we're too much, we're too loud, we're not enough, we're too big, whatever it is, all those lies came from whatever happened prior to age 8. And that's now shaping our thought processes.
Mhm. Which is why it needs to be recycled. I mean,
It,
not recycled, it
absolutely.
needs to be
Yes.
changed, right? And then the very last step for me was reinvention.
Mhm.
And I've reinvented myself several times along this journey, but this last one was very important. I had to let go of the woman I became in order to survive.
Mhm.
She kept me safe for a very long time, but in that safety, she kept me stuck.
Yes.
And I had to let her die a death so that I can resurrect a woman who wasn't giving in to the old patterns, who wasn't believing the narratives that had shaped her previously. And that reinvention is where the survival mode disruptor came from. I recognize not only did I not have an awareness of the residual impact of my trauma. Many other people did not have an awareness of the residual impact of their trauma. And I'm going to say this, and some people may not agree, I do not believe that healing is something we end.
No.
There are some people that believe that you heal and you move on.
And you're done. Yeah.
Yes. So I am very much still on my healing journey. There are things that still trigger me today, and I have to reprocess, reprogram, and then re-event from there. But what I wanted to do was also help other people because I know that I'm not alone. I know that I'm not the only person that has been in survival mode for decades, right? But we don't
Right.
talk about it enough. We don't process it enough. Society is very good with giving us a high five. You survived. We have songs about being survivors, but
Yeah.
that is not the final destination. And once I realized that, I wanted to offer an exodus for other people to not leave survival and
Yeah.
move on to a thriving life of contentment, of happiness, of no longer having an identity tied to something so heavy. Yes, I survived, but now I am thriving in spite of what I went through because I chose to.
So I'm going to ask you a question. Since I agree with you, I think healing is a lifelong journey. We're never done with it. It feels like once we heal one layer, we get to the next layer. If you could wave a magic wand on your healing journey right now, what's one thing that you would change if you could?
I would change my relationship with myself earlier on.
Okay.
I didn't give myself enough grace in the beginning,
Hmm.
which then made healing feel heavy.
Hmm.
If I had been able to give myself more grace, I think I probably would have transformed my life a little earlier.
Okay, so now I'm going to ask you a future question. If we could sit down and talk in 12 months, where would you want your healing journey to be that it's not now? I know,
That's a good question, Angie.
right?
Actually, I think I would want my healing journey to be bolder and louder. I think I don't share enough. Now I'm in this space where I'm helping others. So, when you are working with clients, your story does not necessarily have a place there,
True.
right? But I want to be bolder with my healing and more honest
I love
with
that.
my transformation.
Bolder and louder. I
Yeah.
love it. Yes. Now, okay, we've just been chatting. I knew we were going to just have a chat conversation. I love talking to you. You have something for our listeners based on your
I
survival mode disruption. So tell us about it.
I created a survival mode exit blueprint.
Yay!
It's a workbook that walks you through. So the three steps that I talked about, three phases that I talked about, have been broken down into two steps each. So there are six steps that this blueprint walks you through. And it really is, I believe, the beginning of someone's journey to exiting survival mode.
I love it. Okay, so for the listeners, if they want to get in touch with you, how would you recommend they get in touch with you? But what's the best way?
The best way to get in touch with me is on LinkedIn.
Okay.
Um, that's where I spend 90% of my time. Or info at letitiarenefrancis.com. I like emails as well. Um, yeah, that's the best way. And I mean, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, I'm on TikTok, but my place is LinkedIn.
Okay, so we'll drop all that information in the show notes. We'll also drop the link to go grab her survival mode exit blue plant. That's what you called it, right?
Blueprint.
Blueprint.
Yeah.
Wow, yeah, my brain. So definitely go grab those. Go check out Letitia. She is amazing. And for those of you listening, if you find discomfort in trying to exit survival mode, try movement. I'm also dropping a comment. I have a gift for y'all. It's a free, short, less than 5 minute movement sequence that you can do when you're feeling overwhelmed that brings instant calm, will change your mood instantly so that you can come back and keep working through the blueprint. Because with trauma, with survival mode, we've got to get rid of some of that fight or flight energy in order to help reprocess. So, I'm also dropping the link for my free 5 minute movement sequence in the show notes. Go grab it, grab the blueprint, and work to bring yourself out of survival mode so that you can thrive like the amazing Letitia. So,
Yeah.
yay! Thank you so much for being with me today. I hope that all of you have gotten something from this. I definitely have. She's a powerhouse. Everybody go check her out. And I will see you on the next episode. Bye, everybody.
Bye.